St. Vincent Carib's native identity. At the same time that the Black Carib label served British purposes, however, we also could read it as pointing to the new processes of ethnogenesis and interethnic alliance that began shaping the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean in the post-contact era. When the Spanish arrived in the Caribbean in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they set off a chain reaction of political and social reorganization within the region, as native communities were decimated by Old World diseases and enslavement. Those who survived the initial round of assimilation responded by fleeing to the margins of Spanish control and regrouping as novel tribes and entities. The search for safe havens from European encroachers gave the Lesser Antilles a new geographic significance. Because it lacked the mineral deposits and concentrated native population centers of the mainland and such large islands as Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba, it escaped Spanish attention for the most part and became the new homeland for a heterogeneous group of refugees that became known by the name of Carib. In the 17th century, a second displacement occurred as French and British groups began arriving to try and colonize the Lesser Antilles themselves. Engaging in bloody conflicts with the inhabitants of such islands as St. Kitts, St. Lucia, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, they drove the Caribs to retreat once again to the islands of Dominica and St. Vincent. The increasingly heavy reliance of the French and British on African slavery brought further changes to the state of the Caribs, who continued to shift in terms of ethnic composition as they responded to new types of imperial labor regimes. In particular, the Caribs began incorporating not only diverse Amerindian populations into their numbers, but also runaway Africans from neighboring islands. As a Jesuit missionary, Jean-Baptiste Labat, observed St. Vincent in 1700, quote, "This island is the center of the Carib Republic. This island is also inhabited by a great number of fugitive Negroes, for the most part from Barbados, which being to windward of St. Vincent gives the runaways every possible facility for escaping from their masters' plantations in boats or on piperies or rafts." So even if the Black Carib label derived in large part from such accounts as Young's, Labat's description makes clear that the designation nevertheless usefully highlights a new type of affiliation forming between Amerindian and African populations on St. Vincent. Africans were arriving on the island in significant numbers by the late 17th century and being integrated into the Carib population. Moreover, they were helping to form a political entity formidable enough to be labeled a Carib republic. The term republic reflects the common will of the Caribs to remain free from any external form of sovereignty. The fact that many of the new African members of the group came from the English sugar plantations on Barbados also could be read as shaping later Carib antipathy to the British. Exact figures for how many Africans escaped from Barbados and other places to St. Vincent do not exist, yet a British report from 1735 stated that St. Vincent was populated at that time by 6,000 Africans and 4,000 Amerindians. When the first British settlers arrived in the 1760s, they thus confronted an entrenched population of Caribs who had formed themselves in opposition to the sugar colonies surrounding them. The British also had to deal with the fact that the Caribs had already made strong alliances with the governments of neighboring French-controlled islands. Carib-French contact had begun in the 17th century when missionaries like Labat began traveling to the Lesser Antilles and when early forms of economic exchange based on a trade in subsistence provisions and other goods began to connect the Caribs to French settlers. Indeed, by the early 18th century, the Caribs of St. Vincent had allowed a number of French cultivators to occupy the leeward or western side of the island. Now, of course, the question is, why would the Caribs let the French live on the island when the Caribs were very concerned with keeping St. Vincent autonomous territory? But what I'm arguing is that one very important benefit to allowing a small French presence is that the Caribs were then able to draw on the French as political allies and as protection against other more threatening powers like the British. For instance, and when we look at the historical record, we see that this alliance was very beneficial. For instance, in 1748, the French insisted to the British that the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle recognized St. Vincent as neutral, indigenous-controlled ground. Then in 1768, when the settlement commissioners of the new British government informed the Caribs that they were now subject to the British Crown, and attempted to negotiate with them for access to the island's windward side, the Caribs invoked their long-standing relationship with France. Appearing for the first time in the historical record, Châteauye, this is 1768, not only refused the British his permission, but also declared, "Quel roi?" What king was this of Great Britain? They would listen to the governor of Martinique and no other. Long before 1768, the Caribs had formed a relationship with the various administrators of Martinique, and it seemed had even asked its governor in 1700 to help settle a dispute among themselves over territorial boundaries. They thus turned to Martinique not only in the 1760s to fend off initial British incursions, but also in 1778 when France declared war against Britain in the midst of the American Revolution. Picking up on the political advantage that could be gained from exploiting the British-French rivalry, the Caribs asked the French for military support to oust the British from St. Vincent. So French troops actually arrived in 1779, and the Caribs enjoyed 4 years of liberty from British sovereignty until 1783, when the American Revolution ended and France again ceded its claims to St. Vincent. So the British did end up returning after 1783, and this return sort of indicates the difficulties that the Caribs faced in the second half of the 18th century. Although they had managed to maintain a considerable degree of autonomy up until the late 18th century, they had also suffered from increasingly aggressive policies on the part of the British and the resultant limitations on their mobility and freedom. Still, in 1795, the Caribs made one more effort to exploit the new political opportunities created by the Atlantic revolutions. Rising up against the British to begin the Second Carib War, the Caribs burned sugar plantations and killed their masters, as well as any enslaved Africans who refused to join the Carib cause. At the same time, they recruited the assistance not only of the approximately 4,000 French settlers and enslaved French Africans still living on St. Vincent, but also of French military forces from Guadeloupe. As recently as 1794, Guadeloupe had been under British control. In 1794, however, the Jacobin leader, Victor Hugues, arrived with a Republican army on Guadeloupe to reclaim the island and bring emancipation to its slave population. In a remarkable Caribbean career, Hugues also turned Guadeloupe into a base for other attacks against British colonies in the region. Declaring the Caribs, quote, "our friends and loyal allies," Hugues simultaneously helped to foment revolts on Grenada and St. Lucia. In particular, he sent a multiracial force of free gens de couleur, ex-slaves, and white Frenchmen to fight on St. Vincent alongside an already diverse force of Caribs, French settlers, and the ex-slaves of the French and the British. The fear that such a coalition evoked among British settlers is perhaps best expressed by the St. Vincent botanist Alexander Anderson, who named it a, quote, motley garrison in his unpublished history of the Second Carib War. He further stated, it was disgusting to a British soldier to go through the maneuvers of such a mixed gang which merited no better appellation than banditti. So this is Anderson's, it's obviously very racial rhetoric, but I just chose to quote this because I think it demonstrates how multiracial and how cross-cultural the Carib alliances were that were fighting against the British in 1795. I also quote this because it shows that the British really were afraid of losing the Second Carib War. In the time, in 1795, it wasn't a foregone conclusion who was going to win or lose. So even more horrifying to the British than anything about race, perhaps, was the possibility that the Caribs might actually win this war. Their desperation in the conflict's first few months, which brought significant Carib and French victories, is captured by James Seton, the governor of St. Vincent, who wished for reinforcements that would allow him, quote, not only to repel, but totally to exterminate the savage and merciless race of Caribs. So 1795 is when really a lot of the rhetoric gets much stronger in terms of trying to demonize the Caribs. Although reinforcements arrived, the Caribs and their allies proved adept at evading capture and used their knowledge of the environment to carry out ambushes and to survive. The Caribs were known among the British and the French for their agricultural skills, and military dispatches reveal that the Caribs maintained hidden provision grounds that furnished them with plantains, yams, and other staples. Indeed, the ultimate victory of the British derived in large part from their strategic decision to eliminate these provision grounds and thereby to starve the Caribs and their allies out of the woods. At the same time, it took them several years to bring the war to a definitive conclusion, as the Caribs proved willing to fight on to preserve even the smallest modicum of freedom. For instance, although the French military forces agreed to surrender in June 1796, well over a year after the war had begun, most Caribs refused to abide by the official articles of surrender and remained in the mountains, from which they continued to carry out attacks on British troops. In some ways, we can say that the refusal of the Caribs to give up was tragic, since the British campaign to destroy their provision grounds succeeded in reducing them, many of them, to the brink of starvation and death. As again the botanist Anderson observed, many of the Caribs presented a, quote, dreadful spectacle of misery and distress when they finally did surrender and come out of the woods. Their situation did not improve afterwards, as we all know, as the British settlers had determined to exile them from St. Vincent to Baliceaux, and then they were moved to Roatan. Nevertheless, the Caribs were determined to resist until the last possible opportunity because they had worked to elude imperial control for centuries. Amerindian groups had settled on St. Vincent well before European conquest and turned it into a Carib republic, a refuge from encroaching powers. They had also shown flexibility in incorporating runaway Africans into their numbers and undergoing processes of ethnogenesis that led to the emergence of novel identities. Throughout the 18th century, the Caribs not only manifested an antipathy to British rule, but also formed alliances with the French in order to establish a neutral ground between imperial rivals. They continued to engage in sophisticated political maneuverings by recognizing and taking advantage of revolutionary conflicts in the 1780s and 1790s. Even after the British formally acquired St. Vincent in 1763, the Caribs succeeded in ousting them from the island in 1779 and in prosecuting a long drawn-out campaign in 1795 and 1796. Most significantly, even as they drew heavily on the support of the French during the Second Carib War, the Carib actions demonstrate that they retained a distinct sense of purpose and identity. Leaders like Châteauguay may have claimed French subjecthood, but they did so only when it helped them to achieve their own goal of political autonomy. The position of the Caribs is perhaps best summed up by what one unnamed leader said upon being questioned about his loyalties by José Rossi Irubi, a Guatemalan citizen who had arrived at Roatan to negotiate with the Caribs about their resettlement on the mainland of Central America. As this Carib leader proclaimed, quote, "I do not command in the name of anyone. I am not English, nor French, nor Spanish, nor do I care to be any of these. I am a Carib subordinate to no one. I do not care to be more or to have more than I have." While we could read this statement as a resigned acknowledgement of the Caribs' newly constrained position, we also should take it, I think, as a final defiant statement of independence and self-sufficiency. Thank you.
We'll now have Dr. Melanie Newton to make her presentation. She received a PhD in modern history from Oxford University in 2001. Dr. Newton is currently an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto, Canada. She specializes in the social and cultural history of the Caribbean, and the history of slavery, gender, and emancipation in the Atlantic world. Her most recent publications include The Children of Africa in the Colonies, Free People of Color in Barbados in the Age of Emancipation, published in 2008. Dr. Newton will be presenting the paper, Geographies of the Indigenous, the Early Modern Lesser Antilles in Hemispheric Perspective, a comparative and transatlantic analysis of European, African, and indigenous relations in the Lesser Antilles in the 17th and 18th century. This is part of a current research project entitled This Island's Mind, Indigeneity in the Caribbean Atlantic World.
Okay, let me see if I can get this to, okay. So thank you very much. And I want to say first that I'm very thankful for the experience of being here. not for that little bit though, but anyway. Very thankful to be here, and extremely thankful that I was part of the Baliso trip, even though I didn't fare so well on the boat, but we won't speak too much about that. And I also wanted to say that I'm from the University of Toronto, but I'm from Barbados. I grew up there, so I'm from Barbados via Toronto. So I've set for myself the task, I'm going to speak for 25 minutes, and at 25 minutes I'm stopping. It does not matter where I am in the paper, and I will wrap up so that we can have time for discussion. And my paper today it's entitled Geographies of the Indigenous, Hemispheric Perspectives on the Early Modern Lesser Antilles. And I just want to start with a very brief story. It's a story from a friend of mine who was an anthropologist. She was actually my roommate in graduate school in England. And she researched the anthropology of Rastas in Cuba. And at one point, she kind of had a crisis, as you always do when you're doing a dissertation, and she was worried about the importance of her research, whether it mattered, but she was also actually quite worried about the potential implications of the research that she was doing. And she confided these worries to a Rasta elder, a Cuban Rasta elder, her fear that people might use the research that she was doing to exploit people who she had that was not her intention in collecting the material that she was collecting. And he listened to her quite patiently, and when she was finished, he just told her, put his hand on her shoulder and said, just tell a story that helps. Right? And I always remember that as one of the reasons, I think, for doing history, and I offer this paper in this spirit, as an attempt to tell a story that helps. So the paper that this is part of is much longer than what I will present today, and I've reorganized it a bit to try to fit the time period, so I put the most important information first, and I'm going to emphasize the legal history aspects of this paper. There's other material in it that overlaps quite a bit with what Julie just presented, but I'm going to emphasize the legal history, because I think that's what's most relevant here. So this paper, as I said, as was mentioned earlier, is part of a larger project that traces the role of the indigenous as concept and lived experience in Anglophone Caribbean history, as well as the place of the Caribbean in shaping conceptions of the indigenous in the Atlantic world. And that larger project has a very long time span. It goes from the 16th century right up until 2006. There's a specific set of events in 2006 in Guyana, and I end there. But this paper focuses on the 16th to 18th centuries, and I examine how European colonists sought to write the indigenous people of the Caribbean archipelago out of colonial history, even as that history was unfolding. And the central argument of this paper is that Europeans in the early modern Americas constructed something of a mythical map of distinctions between what they viewed as an indigenous continent, in a sense, on one hand, so a continent with indigenous people and defined by an indigenous presence, and on the other hand, a Caribbean archipelago with an at best ephemeral indigenous presence on the other. Now, Lesser Antillean indigenous people forced Europeans to reckon with their presence, as happened elsewhere in continental America. And between the 1650s and 1660s, English and French colonial officials did begin to move towards a more realistic engagement with the Lesser Antilles as a place which, like the continent, was inhabited by Aboriginal people with whom treaties would have to be made. So they moved towards a policy of acknowledging indigenous sovereignty with treaties and legal agreements in the 1650s and 1660s. However, this new policy coincided with the rise of plantation slavery in the Lesser Antilles, and the rise specifically of the slave trade, which gave the English in particular an urgent motivation for once again denying the presence of Caribbean indigenous people. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the English and the French both viewed legal treaties with Lesser Antillean indigenous people as an impediment to the rapid expansion of African slavery and sugar cultivation. And what they feared most was the presence of people or communities of both African and indigenous ancestry. And the French and the British used this fact of the combined African and indigenous ancestry of indigenous communities in the Lesser Antilles as a quasi-legal grounds for dismissing the notion that they were really Aboriginal people. And both French and British colonists, but particularly the English in the Lesser Antilles, beginning in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, systematically suppressed information that traveled between the Lesser Antilles, Paris, and then to Paris and London, about the presence of indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles, claiming that the quote-unquote real Caribs had all but disappeared, leaving their lands available to be fought over by rival European claimants. And this is part of the wider consolidation of racist thought in the colonial Americas, and the systematic denial that happens elsewhere in the Americas as well of the indigenous claims of people who are of both Aboriginal and African descent. And it's part of the creation of sort of myths of racial taxonomy that suggested that a mixture of a person of someone who is of European and Aboriginal American descent could be quote unquote an Indian, but someone who is of African and indigenous descent could not. They were Okay, I'm assuming that's nothing to do with me. Okay, now the focus of this paper, the immediate focus, is actually a very specific legal document, which is something called the Royal Proclamation of October 7th, 1763. So it was issued on October 7th, 1763 by King George III of Great Britain. Now, the proclamation is a fundamental document in the legal history of relationships between Indigenous people and representatives of Crown authority in Canada. And it's incorporated into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's impossible to overstate the importance of this document. It is the basis of the contemporary legal rights of sovereignty that Indigenous people claim in Canada, in Ontario and Quebec, in relation to the federal government. So it's very, very important. The principal aim of the Royal Proclamation was to restore peace in the Great Lakes, Illinois, and Ohio regions, so this is in North America, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. Now that war was supposed to have been settled by a peace treaty signed in February 1763, and that peace treaty, the Paris Treaty, confirmed British dominance in the Atlantic world. However, that treaty made no mention of the sovereignty of Aboriginal peoples who had also fought in the 7 Years' War. The absence of any references to Indigenous Americans in the treaty helped to spark Pontiac's War, which was an Indigenous uprising in the Great Lakes, Illinois, and Ohio regions in May of 1763. So the Royal Proclamation was passed in response to Pontiac's War, and the Royal Proclamation created a land border between the territories of British colonists and Indigenous North Americans. So it actually created a map, which you can find. You can find this map that designated the territory, the physical territory of Indigenous people, and the physical territory of British colonists in North America. White colonists' opposition to the proclamation's supposed concessions to Aboriginal people was a factor that fed into the American Revolution. Now you're wondering, why is she talking about this Royal Proclamation? Well, according to conventional wisdom, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a North American document, and it is not significant for the history of the British Caribbean. And when I read it as part of this research project, I actually read it initially for comparative purposes. I remembered reading it as an undergraduate. Of course, you never saw it reproduced in full, which I think is quite significant. But I had read it, and I just read it for sort of comparative purposes. So it came as a huge surprise to me when I read it in its entirety to find that the Royal Proclamation does refer in great detail to several newly acquired British territories in the Lesser Antilles. So the proclamation follows on from Article 9 of the Treaty of Paris, which ceded what the proclamation called Grenada to the British. And it spelled out that Grenada referred to the island of that name, together with the Grenadines, and the islands of Dominica, St. Vincent, and Tobago. So in other words, all but what had previously been designated in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle as neutral territories, neutral islands which the British and the French could not agree on. So Article 9 of the Treaty of Paris also gave the neutral island of St. Lucia, which had been captured by the British during the war, to the French, and it made no mention of Indigenous people in St. Lucia. So St. Lucia was not included in the Royal Proclamation. In addition to the 4 territories that made up Grenada, the Royal Proclamation confirmed British control over Quebec and East and West Florida. So Quebec, East and West Florida, which was already laid out in the Paris Treaty. Now, according to Anglo-Jamaican planter and late 18th century historian of the Caribbean, a fellow by the name of Brian Edwards, so Edwards was extremely critical of the Paris Treaty's legal integrity. And he argued that the 9th article of the Paris Treaty, which gave the French and the British full and perpetual sovereignty over these islands, had no legal basis because the Caribs were not mentioned once in the whole transaction, as if no such people existed. So the proclamation can be divided into 4 distinct themes. So the themes are descriptions of these newly acquired governments, empowerment of the colonists, many of whom were French or Spanish speaking, to have assemblies and make laws, regulations for the building of forts and maintenance of soldiers, and finally a set of clauses on the territorial rights of Aboriginal people. So these provisions for Aboriginal rights are the key sections on which contemporary Indigenous land claims in the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec are based. And it is telling that these provisions, these Aboriginal sovereignty provisions, are the only ones in the entire proclamation that excluded Grenada. And these provisions protected Aboriginal people's rights to remain, I quote, unmolested and undisturbed in the possession of some such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, this is us being the British, are reserved for them, Indians, as their hunting grounds. So the proclamation sought to maintain imperial control over colonists' land acquisitions and limit the possibility of conflict with Indigenous people. So the proclamation made it illegal for any governor or commander-in-chief in any of our colonies of Quebec, East Florida, or West Florida to grant warrants of survey or pass any patents for lands beyond the bounds of their respective governments. So basically, a local governor or a local representative could not enter negotiations over land. That was a Crown prerogative. Only the Crown could negotiate with any designated representative of an Indigenous person. So this was a relationship between sovereign states. Right. So as far as the proclamation was concerned, there were no Indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles whose rights merited the consideration of the Crown, even though, as I will hopefully have time to lay out in this paper, it was not actually entirely clear at the time of the proclamation's passage in 1763, that either the French or the British had actually established a legal right to cede any of these neutral islands to each other, even by their own standards. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because of the contemporary significance of this proclamation. And what I lay out in this paper is a history whereby, a very long history, whereby there is a systematic effort in both in sort of discursive effort and legal effort to deny the sovereignty of Indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles for a number of reasons. But the most significant, I think, for the perspective of this paper is because of their African ancestry, because they have African ancestry. And in contemporary legal context, because this law is still in force, right? That fact, the fact that you denied people sovereignty to their land on the basis of racial ancestry, that certainly, and then first you passed laws that permitted that's effectively stated this, and the silence regarding Aboriginal people in the Royal Proclamation, and then proceeded to carry out, as the British did in 1797, a process of ethnic cleansing and genocide that has continuing social and political consequences. That constitutes potentially the grounds for a legal case because the law is still in force, because the Royal Proclamation is still active law, right? So I'm not really going to have time to go through this history, but basically, even before the British and the French arrived in the Lesser Antilles, the Spanish had already sort of laid the ground for this assumption that, in essence, there was not a consistent consistent Aboriginal Indigenous presence in the Lesser Antilles. So Hernan Cortes, when he first went to Mexico in 1519, launches this discourse that distinguishes the civilizations of Mexico and Peru on the basis of what some scholars call monumental indigeneity. So these great builders, these people with a great building tradition who have a social hierarchy, which was somewhat familiar to the Spanish, which the Spanish felt somewhat comfortable with. So the Spanish depictions of the so-called Caribs of the Lesser Antilles as nomadic and non-hierarchical people positioned them almost immediately upon European arrival in the Americas within pre-existing Roman law traditions as legal vagabonds without legitimate territorial claims. So when European incursions into the Lesser Antilles began in the late 16th century with English and Dutch efforts to establish colonies in the Guyanas and the Lesser Antilles, you saw some of these same distinctions between these same assumptions that there is a consistent Indigenous presence in the continent, but not so in these islands. You see this played out in the way that they describe their colonization efforts. So there's a long succession of documents in the colonial archives in the United Kingdom, for example, that describe the Guyanas as a place where colonization is a great idea because there is a settled indigenous population which will be a good labor force, which will work for the British for nothing, which of course is not quite how things turned out. And where, as they say, tobacco is got with far greater ease than in Virginia, the Bermudas, or any other place, by the labor only and pains of Indians, quote unquote. And in other places it is made with the great toil and labor of our own country people. So problematic as this language is, what it speaks to is a recognition of the presence of indigenous people in the Guyanas. Now, most European attempts at Guyana colonization from the 1590s through to the 1650s actually ended in complete failure because indigenous people either annihilated the Europeans or starved them out, right? Despite this pattern of failure, you continue to get this consistent discourse of constructing the Guyanas as a place with an indigenous population that would welcome Europeans. And imperial historians have tended to follow the tone of these 17th century records, acknowledging the important presence of indigenous people in the Guyanas while minimizing the historical role of